Nobody missing. Nobody came looking. And for 5 years, a man in North London murdered young men, kept their bodies in his flat for weeks, and went to work every Monday morning like nothing had happened. He wasn't caught by police. He was caught because of a blocked drain. This is the story of Dennis Nilsen, and it begins on a Tuesday evening in February 1983, with a plumber doing the most ordinary job of his working week. February 8th, 1983, 6:15 in the evening, 23 Cranley Gardens, North London. A young plumber named Michael Catron had been called out to fix that drain. It was cold. It was routine. He crouched beside the drain cover at the side of the terraced house, lifted it, shone his torch into the darkness below, and stopped breathing. The drain was packed with a thick, grey, glutinous, flesh-like substance and dozens of small bones. Catron had been a plumber long enough to know what a blocked drain looked like. He had never seen anything like this. He stood up slowly, walked back to his van, and called his supervisor. And in doing so, entirely by accident, on an ordinary Tuesday evening in February, he ended 5 years of murder that the entire Metropolitan Police Force had completely failed to detect. The man who lived in the attic flat directly above that drain was 37 years old. He worked as an executive officer at the Kentish Town Job Centre in North London, a quiet, diligent civil servant who spent his days helping unemployed people find work. His colleagues described him as helpful, reliable, and unusually kind. His neighbours barely noticed him. He wore wire-framed glasses and neat dark suits, and he smiled at people with the careful, attentive warmth of someone who appeared genuinely interested in what you had to say. His name was Dennis Andrew Nilsen. Dennis Nilsen was born on the 23rd of November 1945 in the small coastal town of Fraserburgh in northeastern Scotland. His childhood was defined by two things: a father whose absence was so total it barely registered in Nilsen's life at all, and a grandfather named Andrew White, whom the young Dennis loved with a complete and consuming devotion. When Andrew White died suddenly in 1951, Dennis Nilsen was 6 years old. His family, following the custom of the time and the place, brought the child to view the open casket. Nobody explained death to the boy. Nobody told him where his grandfather had gone or why he would never move or speak again. What the 6-year-old child understood, in the way that small children understand things that adults have catastrophically failed to explain, was that the person he loved most in the world had become perfectly still, perfectly cold, and would never leave him now. By the time Nilsen arrived in London in the early 1970s, he was a man of careful habits, heavy drinking, and a loneliness so deep it had become structural, built into the very foundations of how he moved through the world. He had served in the British Army for 11 years. He had worked briefly as a Metropolitan Police Constable. He had developed a pattern of forming intense attachments to people who inevitably left him, and every departure carved something out of him that alcohol could temporarily fill, but never replace. In 1975, he moved into a garden flat at 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood, North London, with a man named David Galichan. For 2 years, he had company, regular, dependable, present company, and for 2 years, the darkness held its position. When Galichan left in 1977, Nilsen was alone in the flat in Cricklewood, and the loneliness that closed around him in that empty space was of a completely different order than anything that had come before. On the 30th of December 1978, Dennis Nilsen met a young man in a pub in the Soho area of central London. The young man was 14 years old. His name was never established. He was never identified. One of the many unbearable truths at the heart of this case. Nilsen offered him alcohol, warmth, and the company of someone who appeared to be listening. The young man accepted. They walked together through the cold December streets to Melrose Avenue. They drank through the evening. And when the young man began showing signs of leaving, when the night started moving toward its natural end in the way all nights do, something in Dennis Nilsen that had been building for years made its decision. He strangled the boy with a necktie. When the strangling was not enough, he held the young man's face beneath the water in the kitchen sink until all movement stopped. The killing took minutes. The silence that followed lasted all night. What Dennis Nilsen did next is what makes him unlike virtually any other killer in British criminal history. He did not panic. He did not flee or dispose of the body quickly or try to erase what he had done. He carried the boy to his bathroom and spent the next several hours bathing him carefully, washing the hair, cleaning the skin, dressing the body in fresh, clean clothes, with the patient, deliberate attention of someone caring for a person they intend to keep. He then carried the body to his bed. In the days that followed, he positioned it around the flat, on the sofa, in the armchair beside the television, and he spoke to it. He cooked meals in its presence. He watched television in its company. He created, from the body of the young man he had killed because he could not bear to be left alone, the companionship he had been unable to sustain while that person was still alive. This is the detail that defines Dennis Nilsen and separates him from every other name in the dark Britain story so far. He did not kill out of rage. He did not kill for money or power or dominance. He killed because he could not bear for people to leave. And when they were dead, they finally, permanently stayed. When decomposition eventually made keeping the body impossible, when the reality of what he had done became impossible to share a room with, Nilsen dissected the remains methodically beneath the floorboards of his flat, placed the flesh and organs into a large pot on his kitchen stove and boiled them, crushed the bones and buried them in the garden behind Melrose Avenue. Then he returned to work. He answered the telephones at the job centre. He processed the paperwork of strangers seeking employment. He ate his lunch. He said goodnight to his colleagues. And when the loneliness eventually became unbearable again, when the empty flat in Cricklewood closed back in around him, he put on his coat and walked to a pub and found someone else. Over the next 3 years at Melrose Avenue, he killed 8 more men. Kenneth Ockenden, a 23-year-old Canadian tourist who had come to London to see the city. Martin Duffy, just 16 years old, a runaway who had arrived in London looking for a new beginning. Billy Sutherland. Malcolm Barlow, a young epileptic man who Nilsen had originally called an ambulance for when he found him collapsed on the street, who returned the following day simply to thank him for his kindness, and was killed for the act of coming back. Each victim was met in a pub or on the street, brought to Melrose Avenue with the offer of alcohol and shelter, killed by strangulation and drowning. In 1981, Nilsen moved to the attic flat at 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, a property with no garden, no accessible floorboards, and no means of concealment available to him. He would later tell detectives that some part of him had chosen this flat deliberately as a way of making it impossible to continue. It made no difference whatsoever. John Howlett, Archibald Graham Allen, and on the 23rd of January 1983, a 20-year-old drifter named Stephen Sinclair, the last person Dennis Nilsen would ever kill. At Cranley Gardens, Without a garden to bury remains and without floorboards for concealment, Nilsen adapted his methods with the same cold practicality that characterized every aspect of his crimes. He boiled the flesh from the heads, hands, and feet of his victims in the large cooking pot on his kitchen stove. He flushed the dissected soft tissue down the toilet. He wrapped the larger sections of remains in plastic bags and placed them in the drain at the side of the house. The drain, receiving more than it was designed to process, eventually and inevitably blocked. Michael Catron was called. A torch was shone into the darkness. And the Tuesday evening that Dennis Nilsen had perhaps always known was coming, finally arrived. 3 men had survived encounters with Dennis Nilsen and reported them to the Metropolitan Police between 1978 and 1983. 3 separate individuals had walked into police stations across London and described in clear detail what had happened to them inside his flat. In each case, for reasons rooted in the prejudices and institutional failures of the era, a time when crimes involving gay men were routinely taken less seriously by British police, the reports were not properly pursued. The door to Melrose Avenue and then to Cranley Gardens remained closed. The killings continued, the drain kept filling, and Dennis Nilsen kept going to work. On the evening of February 9th, 1983, Detective Chief Inspector Peter Jay of the Metropolitan Police waited outside 23 Cranley Gardens for Dennis Nilsen to return home from the job centre. When Nilsen arrived and was informed that human remains had been discovered in the drain, he led Jay up the stairs to the attic flat without argument or resistance. The smell reached the detective before he reached the top step. When Jay asked Nilsen directly where the rest of the body was, Nilsen replied without any visible distress that there were several bags in the wardrobe in the other room. He then sat down at his kitchen table, accepted a cup of tea, and talked for 4 hours. 15 murders, he said, possibly 16. He was not entirely certain of the precise number. He named those he could name and described in careful detail those he could not. He was cooperative, precise, and completely calm throughout. When Jay asked him why any of it, all of it, the years of it, Nilsen considered the question for a moment and replied that he was, in all probability, the last person who would be able to answer that. On the 4th of November 1983, at the Old Bailey in London, Dennis Andrew Nilsen was convicted of 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The judge recommended he serve a minimum of 25 years. In 1994, this was changed to a whole life order, meaning he would never be released. Nilsen spent his years in prison writing extensively. Thousands of pages of memoir, analysis, and self-examination about his crimes, his loneliness, his childhood, and the men he had killed. He never expressed genuine remorse for a single one of them. He died in prison on the 12th of May 2018 at the age of 72. Of the 12 men confirmed to have been murdered by Dennis Nilsen, only 8 were ever identified. The remaining 4 are still unknown. They were people. Someone's sons, someone's brothers, someone's missing friends, who came to London, met a quietly spoken man with wire-framed glasses and a kind and attentive smile in a North London pub on a winter evening, walked with him through the cold streets to a warm flat, and were never seen again. Nobody filed a missing persons report. Nobody came to the police. Nobody came looking at all. And that silence, the silence that surrounded those 4 unknown lives then and surrounds them still, is perhaps the most honest thing this story has to say about the city they came to, the era they lived in, and the kind of darkness that thrives not in the extraordinary, but in the perfectly, devastatingly ordinary.